Since 2018, the Anita and Antonio Gotto Lecture Series has featured compelling conversations by renowned writers and scholars across a range of faith traditions and academic disciplines.
But I find that in this time, religious communities are where some of the best conversations are taking place, because there is a spirit of forgiveness, tolerance, forbearance, willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt.
And there is this one skill at the center of every healthy family, company, classroom, community, or nation. It's the ability to see someone else deeply, to know another person profoundly, and make them feel heard and understood.
Tonight, Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, a 2,000-member congregation in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, a church committed to the life of the mind as well as life-changing service to others, welcomes you to the 2020 Gotto Lecture. Good evening. My name is Scott Black Johnston. I'm the senior pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church has a heart for challenging moral, cultural, and spiritual conversations. Growing up, I attended a church where people's biggest fear was that a controversial, multi-sided issue might somehow sneak into the sanctuary. Members of that church loved to say, "I wouldn't touch that topic with a 10-foot pole." Here at Fifth Avenue Church, we take a different approach. We intentionally equip ourselves with 11-foot poles. We deliberately engage topics around which there's a diversity of opinion. We approach these difficult but culturally important issues without yelling, without name-calling, and without vitriol. We strive to listen with empathy and to speak in ways that are tempered with grace and rigorous do-your-homework thinking. We believe this work is our calling. This is what the pursuit of wisdom looks like. This is what it means to live an authentic spiritual life. Tonight's conversation about challenging matters is made possible by a generous gift from two of New York's finest educators. In their heart of hearts, Anita and Tony Gotto are teachers. Anita, an elementary educator with an expertise in child development, and Tony, a renowned cardiologist and former dean of Weill Cornell Medical School, saw the promise of this lectureship. It's because of their vision and their hard work that we are all here tonight. Anita and Tony, we thank you. Since 1875, the walls of this sanctuary have borne witness to a number of important events in this city. This room hosted the dual funeral for President Teddy Roosevelt's mother and wife. It was in this room in December of 1965 that Duke Ellington and his orchestra premiered and recorded his sacred concert. In this room, just a few years ago, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilynne Robinson opined on religion and literature. In recent years, this room hosted, on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, our good Roman Catholic neighbor, Cardinal Timothy Dolan. And in this room, just a couple of years ago, the Reverend William Barber announced a revival of Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. Tonight, these walls continue their tradition of witnessing vital conversations about things that matter. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the words and thoughts of Emma Green. Emma Green is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers politics, policy, and religion. In her time at the magazine, Ms. Green has written about the persecuted Christians living in Iraq's Nineveh Plain and about diaspora communities of Chaldean Catholics who have settled now in Detroit. She's reported from rural America too, winning acclaim for her account of the Society of St. Pius X, a group of Christians who took over an old Jesuit seminary and brought transformation to a small Kansas town. I recently asked Emma which of her recent stories has been closest to her heart. She responded by saying that asking a journalist to single out one story for special praise is sort of like asking a parent, which of these children do you love the most? However, Ms. Green did indulge me by saying that she was profoundly and personally moved by the series of articles she wrote in the aftermath of the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, a deeply disturbing event in which a professed white supremacist killed 11 Jews during worship. A courageous writer, willing to tackle tough topics with clarity of eye and empathy of heart, Emma Green has received national recognition for her reporting. Earlier this year, she was named the 2020 Laureate of the George W. Hunt Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters. Friends, it's my honor to present the 2020 Gotto lecturer, Emma Green. Her chosen topic for this evening, only 12 days away from an election of some import, is Red, Fight, and Blue: How Religious America Became So Divided.
I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. It is just such a delight to join this community, which intentionally puts itself at the crossroads of extremely difficult questions of religion and politics, and to join at such a time as this. We're just a few days before the 2020 election, at a time of intense crisis in America. I want to thank the people who helped to bring me here, to the sponsors of this lecture, Anita and Tony Gotto, to the staff of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church who have been so kind and encouraging to me, including Stephanie Kelly and Kelly Picayo, and of course to Scott Black Johnston, who I have gotten to know a little bit in conversations leading up to this lecture. I feel a little guilty because I can't help myself when I get on the phone with a pastor, peppering him with questions, and I hope that he has enjoyed our conversations as much as I have. It's such a wonderful thing to be in this church specifically to talk about the lecture that I have chosen for this evening: Red America, Blue America, and potentially Red Church, Blue Church. The overwhelming evidence in my reporting is that partisan identity has come to dominate all other forms of identity and community, and that includes, in many places in America, church, religion, our spiritual and faith communities. I want to open with a story, and I have to confess that I have nuns on my mind in the lead up to this election. I recently traveled to Scranton, Pennsylvania, in the northeast part of the state, where Joe Biden claims his childhood home and speaks about often on the campaign trail. When I was there, I met Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, who were Joe Biden's educators when he was a child. I wanted to understand, in speaking to them, a little bit more about the candidate and also about the dynamics of this election. Our conversation was delightful. We gathered in the Friendship Garden behind their center, their home, and they laid out on a table for me some individually wrapped packages of Ritz crackers and saltines, which was a COVID-appropriate way of offering hospitality. There was Sister Terry and Sister Donna, Sister Margaret and Sister Ellen. They all sat in their masks and spoke frankly about the sense of pain that they feel about the juncture that America is at. We got to talking about the election. I was there to hear more about their charism and what animates them as a faith group, but we couldn't help but turn to this juncture that America is at. Sister Ellen, who is the superior of the group, was talking about this phrase that Vice President Biden uses, that we're in a battle for the soul of America. She said, "I love that phrase because it's the deepest part of us. We are in a battle for the soul of America." She had a real sense of pain around the anger and divisiveness that tends to animate American culture today. One of the other sisters, Sister Donna, told me a story about the lead up to the 2016 election, where she spent many, many days snatching flyers off of the windshields of cars in the parish parking lot. If you vote for Hillary Clinton, you'll go to hell. If you vote for Donald Trump, you'll go to heaven. And I can't tell you how angry she was seeing this propaganda, as she called it. I was surprised in a certain way by the way that she offered explanation here. She said there are some people who have been knocking at the door of the House trying to overturn Roe versus Wade for how many years, 30 or 40? Rather than knocking at that door for 40 years, let's make sure no one has to choose that. So it's a really interesting framing to me to be presented by a nun, but all the more so because in a strange way, for those who follow religion and politics, you might notice that this election cycle has turned into a low-key battle of the nuns. You have on the other side a figure like Sister Dee Dee Byrne, who spoke at the Republican National Convention. She wore a full black habit. She approached the lectern and talked about her life in service, one that would be very, very similar to the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary that I met in Scranton. Instead, she presented an opposite picture and an opposite pitch for what we should do moving into 2020. She said that President Trump is the most pro-life president in history. She accused Vice President Biden of embracing infanticide. I bring these two women, the women of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Sister Dee Dee Byrne, into conversation together, not because I don't think that they would earnestly see each other as sisters. They are women of the same Catholic faith. They've made many similar life choices, taking vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity, embracing a lifestyle in community, and giving themselves over to their faith. But it's striking to me to see women who could be so similar, who have such a shared faith and a shared vision for what God commands us and teaches us, how different they could be in their understanding of how to apply that theology in the lived world. Their interpretations of politics are radically different, and I have to think that part of what they're reflecting back is this sense of partisanship, of tribal division that we have come to have in America, even among people who might otherwise find fellowship. This story is relevant to understanding the election. Each candidate, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, claims faith and religion and the moral high ground in their campaign. But the story that I actually care about more is the way that their supporters feel about this question of the moral high ground and the irreconcilability of their views with the other side. I have noticed over and over again in my reporting that there are many people in America who find it incomprehensible how a friend or a neighbor might support another candidate, a different candidate for office, and moreover, that they don't want to reach out to find any kind of common ground. They don't want to build community with people of difference. These are divisions that are going to outlast this political moment, whatever happens in the next couple of weeks. They are not just divisions about President Trump. They're not even mostly about President Trump. When I look out on the American cultural landscape, I see fracture within faiths. I give examples, for example, the United Methodist Church, which is currently going through a schism over the question of human sexuality, but also pastors leaving their own congregations over a sense that they've become too hostile to a certain political point of view. I see fracture within local communities. To give a local story in New York, up in the neighborhood where I live, Washington Heights and Inwood, there's a little cafe called Indian Road Cafe. The owner there has signs posted, Black Lives Matter, but he also said in an interview with MSNBC that he voted for President Trump. And immediately within the neighborhood, there were protests and movements to get everyone to boycott that cafe, which is a beloved local institution. I'm a liberal guy, he said, but voting for Trump was something that made him intolerable to those who live in that area. I see fracture within families. Just the other day, I was talking on the phone with a woman who was talking about the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court and speaking about the WhatsApp messages that were flying between her liberal family members and her own more conservative perspective about what this meant for the future of democracy. These questions of division and fracture hit home directly with my work in journalism. We are living in a time of information fracture to the point of dueling realities. There's a total lack of trust in the media. I think we rank about as low as Americans' trust in the federal government, which is not giving any compliments to my profession. And there's a harmful promotion of untruths, sometimes intentionally, by people who call themselves journalists. Questions as simple as whether to wear a mask to protect your neighbor are called into question as something that is debatable or politicized. And in this environment, I find it extremely hard to know the way forward, to do good work, when I know that when I am approaching a community or an individual, that starting level of trust may be so low. A big reason for all of this is that partisan identity has become supreme over all others, and we've sorted ourselves into irreconcilable tribes. There's really wonderful political science research that, as a body, shows that partisanship has reigned supreme. A 2018 book called Prius or Pickup by the scholars Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler have showed that our partisan affiliation leads us to sort ourselves on all sorts of lines, not just who you vote for, Republican or Democrat, but the kinds of cars that we drive, the children's names that we select, the brands that we purchase, the music that we listen to, the television that we watch, the food that we eat, and the areas where we live. They talk about the division between a more fluid sense of identity and a more fixed sense of identity, an orientation towards openness, inclusiveness, and welcome, which tends to be more liberal, or an orientation towards tradition and structure, which tends to be more conservative. These reigning identities, they say, really determine very much about how we choose to live our lives. At The Atlantic, we've partnered with the Public Religion Research Institute to do research onto this question and found in a recent study that roughly a quarter of Americans seldom or never meet someone of a different race, and they dislike interacting with people of different sets of beliefs. Perhaps my favorite piece of research along these lines is a set of study questions that have been done since the 1950s around the percentage of Democrats and Republicans who would be upset if their child were to marry someone of the opposite political party. In that recent study between the PRI and The Atlantic, 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans said they would be unhappy about their child entering into a marriage with someone from the opposite political party, which is a huge increase from when these studies first started being taken. To me, that's so powerful because it says something about who we want to be in our family, who we want to be in the most intimate circles of our lives, and the fact that this kind of difference, political difference, difference of ideology and ideas, has come to be the most alienating difference in the United States. Why is this happening, and how does it affect our communities? These are the big questions that I've tried to tackle in my writing in the recent years. I've observed some trends and patterns, and frankly, have had some startling moments doing interviews. And so I want to share a few of these stories with you. The first real trend that I've noticed is a sense that national political debates and abstract questions, this all-out war and division of Americans into teams, creates an extreme sense of dislocation and disorientation for many people. It makes it hard for them to reconcile their reality on the ground, their sense that they knew their community when that community is at odds with who they are politically. A few years ago, I got the privilege of meeting a woman named Beth Moore, who is arguably the most famous Bible study teacher in America. She is ubiquitous even outside of her Southern Baptist world. Her Bible studies are often chosen by women to take on and learn about the Bible. She had a moment in the lead up to the 2016 election where, after a lifetime of largely trying to stay quiet about politics, to be largely accessible and available to anyone with different views, she felt like she couldn't stay quiet anymore. She chose to write a series of tweets after the Access Hollywood tape came out, revealing President Trump's, then candidate Trump's, comments about the way that he treated women. And she wrote about her sense of despair, seeing pastors in this denomination that she loved coming out to defend those comments. What happened was a rather astonishing story. People mailed her Bible studies, these booklets, back to her offices in droves. They cut them up. They tweeted that they would never do them again. She got phone calls from prominent pastors in her denominational universe telling her that she had to recant, that she had crossed a line. And over time, as I followed her and all of the self-searching that she was doing, she came to feel that she was homeless. In a world that she had once felt was very much hers of faith and belief, where she found people who protected her and loved her, she no longer recognized the people who purported to be leaders. And ultimately, this has led her to be in a place where she speaks more freely and yet speaks with much more sadness about all that she's lost. I find in this story a resonance that I see in many other kinds of my reporting. There's a fundamental mismatch in the stories that we tell ourselves as Americans about how we got to this moment as a nation. I recently wrote a piece about what I came to call, perhaps too irreverently, the racism consultants to the white evangelical world. I talked to a pastor whose name was Philip Pinckney. He is a Black pastor in Charleston who's in his 30s. And he is one of many people around the evangelical world, but even more broadly, the white Christian world. People who are of minority race or ethnicity, who are often thrust into roles within their communities of being the people who edit statements late at night in Google Changes, who are called on to advise a pastor on their statement, who are put into these unofficial roles where they are having to guide their church through moments of racial tension, including the video that came out of George Floyd's death earlier this summer. Speaking to Pastor Pinckney, he said, if you go into a church and say, hey man, the white Jesus you have on the wall is a lie. There's no way a Middle Eastern Jew would have looked like that. Now you're attacking the Bible. These are the hills upon which we're prepared to die. He and many others told me the way that language is policed in the world that they live in. On the one hand, they do hear expressions of a willingness to hear their stories about racism and racial discrimination, but they're very aggressively policed in the terms that they can use, talking about systemic racism or social justice, talking about intersectionality, critical race theory, radical feminism, or cultural Marxism. This language gap, to me, is so powerful because it points to a larger sense of division that we have as a society. The very words and terms we use to talk about this sense of fracture and division that we're experiencing don't match up. And in that way, I think it's much harder for us to listen to one another about the experience that we have, including listening to people within our own communities, especially people of color, who are trying to share their experiences about what it's like to move in those worlds. A final trend that I've noticed is the sense that national politics has become the exclusive field where we attempt to duke out battles over who we are as a nation. It's a winner-take-all mentality that the culture needs to be one. And this is driven, I think, in many ways by fears, real and imagined, that the public square is going to become inhospitable to people who are liberal or to people who are conservative. To me, there is a genuine question right now over whether the American pluralistic compromise can be sustained, this sense of agreement that we have as a country, that we can be many people who are different living together as a country. I pondered this question last year with a story that I reported on a little town called St. Mary's in Kansas, where a group of parishioners who follow the group of the Society of St. Pius X essentially moved in 40 years ago and created a paradise as they see it, a Catholic paradise. Now, this is a Catholic paradise that's very, very different than many American Catholics would have experienced growing up, let alone many Americans. They genuinely believe in the church's teaching on birth control and have lots and lots of children and lots of minivans. There is a widespread devotion to attending Mass, and Mass is presented in Latin, celebrated in Latin, rather than in the vernacular, as you will see in most Catholic churches. This is not a way of life that would appeal to many people in the United States, but what was so powerful to me about that community and what was so provocative about that community as a question is whether America might be a more peaceful place if there were space for all of us to have our little St. Marys looking in radically different ways, where we could be as we wish to be, that other people might find extreme or offensive, but that could ultimately turn down the temperature on this national political battle that we often experience. All of these trends and case studies leave us with a question, and I think this is a question that's very much on our minds as we sit here now a couple weeks from a pivotal election. Where do we go from here? I'm sorry to tell you this, but none of this is going to end on Election Day. The phenomenon that I'm describing is much more enduring. It's this sense of looking across at our neighbors of different faiths or different political views and seeing a foreigner, someone who is intolerable. I'm not trying to create false equivalents or soft pedal the responsibility of our leaders. I do think that our leaders have exacerbated this situation. President Trump is notoriously a political leader who sees and relishes a sense of us versus them. At the Republican National Convention, he said, "We're here and they're not," splitting America into his supporters and those who don't support him. But these problems also aren't going away under Biden. There are significant disagreements on the left over these questions of tolerance and what space there is in the Democratic Party. There are disagreements on the right over what to do in a post-Trump era and whether it's possible to recover a vision for a more diversifying, inclusive party after the president leaves office. And in general, there's a sense in our national politics that our meeting spaces for compromise are essentially dead. As a reporter, my most useful function is to ask questions. So here are my questions for where we go from here. First, I want to know whether Americans are going to get comfortable in their sense of homelessness. This is the word that I hear perhaps more than any other when I'm out reporting, making phone calls, talking to people all over the country. Coming back to our story of our friends the nuns, I hear from many Catholics the sense that no party can fully accommodate all of their beliefs and the teachings of the Catholic Church. And more broadly, there's a sense among many of many different forms of Christianity that Jesus would not easily find a home in a political party in the United States. I think this could be true, this could be said of many, many different religious groups, not just those who are Christian. A sense that if you really believe that your religious and spiritual identity has supremacy above all of others, that's likely going to leave you without a clear political party. I wonder whether there will be substance and form given to this sense that many people have, that prioritizing Republican versus Democrat neither builds community nor leads to a fulsome life and can even be corrosive to that. On that note, I'm also curious whether there is going to be a period of flourishing and building that comes after the COVID-19 pandemic. This is something that I hear over and over again, a sense of sadness, isolation, and pain that communities feel, not being able to gather in person for worship in many cases, and certainly not being able to gather for the kinds of events that define life, weddings, babies, funerals where we can stand together and mourn. And yet, I do see people straining towards community in this sense of isolation that we have. These are the spaces where our identities get fleshed out, where they become more complex. Being able to meet together in the space of a church or a synagogue or a mosque allows us to understand people as people rather than as political actors or voters. And I wonder if this sense of yearning that I see all across America as we sit in isolation will flourish and perhaps restore some of that sense that we have of each other's humanity. But the ultimate question, in my eyes, is whether we've lost our civic knack for living side by side with people we disagree with. These days, civility gets mocked as a false or naive virtue, and it's associated with both sidesisms that are no match for our politics of domination. I think that has truth. And I think that a sort of blind yearning towards civility could ultimately lead us in a very bad direction. But in a time of rampant untruth, politely entertaining all views can be dangerous, especially for someone in my profession, and yet I have a deep belief in my soul that seeking and creating understanding is my job as a reporter. It's my job even when I encounter ideas and people that my readers won't like or that I find alienating. I am an ambassador or a guide. I have a privilege as a reporter of getting to go places and talk to people that many of my readers would never encounter. And it's my job to try to understand who they are and why they live their life the way that they do, the conflicts that define their community and their identity, and to bring that back to my readers with a sense of empathy, but most of all, with a sense of clear-eyedness. I get a lot of pushback, but this is the work, and it will be the work after the election. Following along as communities decide how to open their doors, how expansive their views can be, and how defined by politics they want to be. As a writer, I often find myself Googling for synonyms. I'm not above confessing that. And these days, the synonyms I'm Googling most often are words like precipice and crisis. We have cliffs, turning points, crossroads, a crux, the verge of disaster. And I regret to tell you that I do not think that I'm going to be stopping Googling these terms anytime soon. This is a moment in American life that feels definitional. There's a real sense that our collaborative project of nationhood, out of many, one, is at risk of failing. This election is a symptom, not just a cause, and the election won't fix what we've become. The small hope I can offer you is that as I'm talking to people in this time of COVID-19, of very tense politics, of grief and mourning and lament over racial discrimination, there is a common sense of lament. All different kinds of Americans tell me constantly that they do not want to live this way. They don't recognize their country, and they don't wish for us to be this. I think that's, too, also revealing about who we are, as much as we may be divided into tribes and teams. This sense that we can still mourn and lament, a sense of coming together in difference and in fellowship. And perhaps that's a small sign that there's a way back from the precipice if we have the will to take it. Thank you very much.
Emma, thank you so much. That was stimulating, fascinating. The stories, the places that you visit, the insights that you have, they're a gift to us, and I thank you. I want to start this evening with a biographical question for you, and basically, I'm wondering if you'd tell us a little bit about your life path. Have you always wanted to be a journalist? Are you living the dream right now, writing for The Atlantic? How did you end up covering for The Atlantic the topics that everybody says should not be introduced into polite conversation, religion, and politics?
It's true that I am perhaps not the best dinner party guest, because not only are my subjects of choice religion and politics, but I have a reporter's habit of asking rude and stubborn questions to people, even when I'm in social company. In terms of how I got here, I had the good fortune in growing up of traveling through different kinds of religious worlds, where it became very clear to me very early on that faith is something that can be a powerful motivator for how people order their lives and make decisions, including in politics, but in other areas of life. I grew up in Tennessee, which is a very religious place. Nashville has a real bid to be the buckle of the Bible Belt, and knew as just friends and neighbors, mentors, people who were deeply, deeply faithful. I went to a Catholic college, Georgetown, and learned a lot about the Jesuit spirituality and the teachings of Catholicism. And I often joke that I am a poster child for a Georgetown liberal arts education, because I actually use the facts that I learned in lectures and seminars in my everyday work. And as a reporter, I found that when given the opportunity of what to write, I wanted to write about these questions of religion and politics, because it's a door that you can walk through to access basically anything about someone's life. You can ask them questions about their faith and get stories about their family, about their community, about trauma, about politics, about pop culture. So it really presents a rich field of exploration. And so in answer to your other question, I do feel a little bit like I'm living the dream, in the sense that I get the privilege of talking to people about all of these really intimate and important topics.
Thank you. One of the words, and it was a word that was in my introduction, it was a word that cropped up a couple of times in your lecture. It's a word that we are seeing appear with surprising frequency, I think, right now in American discourse, is the word empathy. And President Trump has been accused by some as being a person who has a sort of empathy deficit. And others have responded back, no, it's cultural elites who demonstrate an empathy deficit in failing to understand why segments of our society would vote for Trump in the first place. Could you talk to us a little bit about empathy? Do we have an empathy deficit in this country? What conditions do you see out there that cultivate empathy? And I do want to say, one of the things that drew me to your writing is this sense of you feeling empathy for all these different groups that you're talking with.
You know, one of the principles that I follow in my reporting on religion is the anti-National Geographic rule, which is not anything about National Geographic, the magazine, which is terrific, but the kind of mentality of going on safari to see people who are unlike my readers and to treat them as though they're wild animals that you might encounter somewhere. I think it's very important as a reporter to try to understand to the best of my ability what motivates someone, why they're telling their story about their faith, about their political choices, about where their community is, and their story about who they are, what their truth is. And that's not to say that I think the role of a reporter is just to be a stenographer or to uncritically accept the stories that people tell us about their motivations, their communities, the fault that they're at, the harm that they might be doing to others. I think it's very important to ask those critical questions. Skepticism is an extremely important faculty of journalism, and yet I think that overall, the best service that I can do for my readers is to help them encounter people who they normally wouldn't encounter, maybe wouldn't want to encounter, and to have to think a little bit more about what motivates them. And I'm lucky to say that's true of people who read me who would describe themselves as conservative or coming from a conservative religious background, and people who describe themselves as liberal, even secular. I think that ultimately increases our capacity to participate in the civic project that is America, because fundamentally, this country is built on our ability to take our ballots to the voting box, respect that every person is supposed to have one vote, and to respect the outcome of those votes, and to use our power and our advocacy to try to move towards a better vision of the country, while also recognizing that other people might come from a different point of view. And so if I can do a little bit to increase that civic capacity, I think that will be just an enormous thing for me to be proud of. And I think it's just little drops that each story hopefully can do to contribute to that.
I've been trying to think, as you're giving that answer and during the lecture, especially when you were talking about, is it Beth Moore, the Bible study leader who got all those documents mailed back to her and the vitriol that she experienced. I've been trying to think, what's the opposite of empathy? And I'm wondering, at first I was thinking, is it shaming? No. I think it's almost shunning. It's a rejection. And one of the things that we've got going on right now, and this is reflected in a number of the questions that have come in to you, is just this feeling that there's so much at stake, and underneath, maybe it's ostracization, you know? I mean, maybe it's just this, you're an anathema for believing what you believe. I can't engage with you. I can't even read your materials anymore. At least three of the questions here tried to get you to talk about what dynamics help us get beyond that sense that the other is so wrong that they have to be silenced?
Well, I'd love to make a few distinctions there, because I think it's a critical question. This goes back to that question I posed in the lecture. Do we have this capacity to sit side by side with people? And a corollary to that is, are there times when maybe we shouldn't sit side by side with people? And I certainly want to face that question full on. So a couple distinctions I would make are, first, that I think a different lens of criticism should be applied to our leaders than to other people who are regular citizens and Americans, people who might be members of our community, who might walk in through the door of a church or a synagogue. I think our leaders absolutely should be held to a standard for what they say, the implications of those statements, and what they do, their actions, their policies, and the real harms that those can have on people's life. I don't want to soft pedal or to excuse in this effort to try to bring more of this space for common ground or civility. I think it's important to speak truth. That's a core part of my work. But I also think that when it comes to regular people, people you might encounter through your family, through friends who might walk in through the door of a church, I do think that the bar in America is high for people who are ejected from society. Obviously, we as a country have this push-pull process of figuring out our norms, what's acceptable, what's not, what's language we can use, what's language we can't use. But ultimately, I think one of the great privileges of thinking about that question in this space, a space of faith, is this idea that people are flawed and potentially also redeemable. And when it comes to trying to negotiate that push-pull of whether they should be ejected from society completely, I do think that it's really important for us, again, in this sort of civic habit, to try to find ways to speak honestly and truthfully, to offer reprimand when needed and censure when needed, but also to try to understand that people are people and to create space for people to grow and change.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. This is an interesting question, comes from my colleague Werner, and he says, have you witnessed stories where people have crossed party lines entirely on specific issues after an experience of radical empathy and listening? Is it happening? Do people change their minds anymore, ever?
I do think so. We're going to see perhaps during this election whether there is a lot of that line crossing with parties, and that will be something telling, something that I'm watching for. Whether the conditions of the Trump administration have caused a lot of people to say, I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, but I'm voting for Joe Biden, this isn't how I want to live. Or in some cases, the opposite circumstance, people who held their nose and voted third party in 2016, deciding that they enthusiastically want to support President Trump, which is happening too. The example that I'll give, which I've heard anecdotally the most often as something that I want to report on in the coming days, is especially around this issue of race in church settings. I've heard from a lot of people who have been members of traditionally white communities and congregations who, for better or worse, found themselves in 2020 saying, wow, where have I been all this time? Joining book clubs where they're reading texts about racism, trying to actually build relationships where before there's just been sort of trite statements offered about racial reconciliation and racial healing. I think there are a lot of people who are earnestly trying to grapple with those questions. And you could say late to the party, where have you been? But I think that transformation is really important for this broader transformation of how people are thinking about their votes. If your mind is being reordered around the kinds of issues that you need to put first, and you suddenly have a better ability to hear when, for example, Black brothers and sisters in the church are telling you how they're feeling about politics, I think that really has the potential for long-term transformative change.
I'm smiling because you couldn't have given a better answer, especially your last illustration for Werner, who is one of the people heading up our anti-racism task force, and that is, or they don't like to be called task force. I name everything a task force. But that's exactly the kind of hope that you just articulated that they have for the conversation that they're seeking to engender here at this church. So thank you for that wonderful answer. This question comes from Erin, and it's, I'm going to kind of phrase it slightly more broadly than she did, but her question is about disinformation. And what she asks is, what is the role of religious communities in debunking? Is that something that's ought to be on their plate? And I have a little bit of an addendum to this, but I'm going to let you answer first before I give my response.
So one of my favorite articles written by a colleague at large of mine in the Religion Reporter Corps, which is not very big. We're a friendly and merry crew because there are, a dozen of us across national publications. Sarah Pulliam-Bailey, who's a terrific reporter at the Washington Post, wrote a story early into the Trump administration talking about her upbringing in an evangelical home where the newspaper and the Bible sat together on the kitchen table, and she was taught that truth is truth, that reporting goes along with the Bible, there's no clash between the two of them because it's about facts and truth. And she expressed this sense of disorientation around hearing people in the world that she grew up in contest the media and its veracity or its commitment to truth-telling, and also a sort of sense that lies were being spread or disinformation was being spread or conspiracies were being spread in these worlds that she had come to learn were about teaching and promoting and believing in the truth. So I bring that up as an example because I do think that partisanship and the information channels that people use to access their facts really does shape in every part of American culture their sense of what is true, and church is no exception to that. If you go to a Southern Baptist church somewhere in the South, you might encounter very, very different narratives around Joe Biden and his crimes against humanity than you would going to a nice mainline church somewhere in New York City talking about President Trump. And I think that is a huge problem because I think church and religious community is a space where people go to talk about what's true, to debate what they think is real and factual. I think those two things do go together. So I don't know that I'm recommending that your church starts a task force on debunking all of the disinformation out there, the wrong media articles, because I can tell you that would take a lot of resources and time because there's a lot out there. But in terms of this core concern that church communities and religious communities broadly need to be spaces where truth is truth and there's not an argument about that, facts are facts, I think that's really, really critical.
I agree. I completely agree with that. I find the challenge to be exhausting, I have to say. And it's in any given week as I'm trying to decide what's said, the most important thing that can be said on behalf of truth and faith. It's a hard decision to make because what is the burning disinformation that needs to be debunked for one person is not even on the radar screen of somebody else who's got a totally different issue, maybe even, believe it or not political, that they're struggling with that I'm aware of. And so it's I'm in a small cohort of pastors, and our joke with each other is, who am I going to disappoint this Sunday? Because it seems impossible right now to satisfy those who are like, I'm only happy with church if it addresses this week, and I'm only happy, and I'm so tired of church addressing that every week. I'm not even looking for balance. I'm looking for truth. I'm looking for what's calling out to me, but this is not my response. This is yours.
I don't envy your job and having to hold a pulpit during this time. That seems like a complicated writing job.
There are some challenges. This is actually a good transition to an article that I wanted to talk to you about. This is by Yana Krupnikoff and John Barry Ryan. It appeared in the New York Times this past week. These two both teach political science at Stony Brook University, and the title of the article is "The Real Divide in America is Between Political Junkies and Everyone Else." The basic thrust of the article is to suggest that there are extreme partisans on both sides. They represent 15 to 20% of that slice of the electorate. They're totally plugged in. They engage heavily in social media on behalf of their parties. But in between, there are large chunks of Democrats and Republicans who are not as plugged in, who don't pay as close attention to politics, who are not necessarily as wrung out about the importance of this election. And it's hard for those on the ends to accept that that's where they're at, because everybody ought to be here. But it's also interesting, they surveyed these groups of people, and they discovered that the people who are the more firm partisans have a different set of answers about what the country's biggest problems are than the people who are in the middle. So the intense partisans would say that issues like immigration on the right and issues like the Supreme Court nomination on the left are the most important issues of our time. In the center, there's agreement, actually, on what the most important. Both Democrats and Republicans in the center, who are less invested in their party, agree that the biggest issues facing the country right now are low wages and the opioid crisis. And I think that's a fascinating thing. And so I'm just wondering how that kind of translates into your analysis of what's going on in the country right now. There's so many layers to these divides.
So I'll answer the question by citing the work of one of my favorite political scientists. His name is Eitan Hersh, and he's at Tufts University. He wrote a book that came out earlier this year called Politics is for Power. And it was all about this problem of what he calls political hobbyism. The people who consume politics not just because they're trying to be informed citizens, but because it's almost an activity, it's entertainment. They watch MSNBC, they're tweeting, they're reading all of the political news, they're having these political debates where they're talking in huffy terms about the most important thing facing our country. And his whole theory about political hobbyism is that it's really corrosive for political culture. I think the first reason is that it amps up the stakes of these abstract national political conversations, which is some of what I was speaking about in the lecture. But the other point that he makes is that it's a distraction away from the actual stuff of politics. I'm a politics reporter, so you can take my word at a grain of salt. I'm employed to say that politics is important. But when I talk about politics being important, I agree with Hersh to a certain extent, which is state and local politics, your county water board, the school board, the negotiations that you're doing with your neighborhood, to a certain extent your state house and some of the local level legislation that you're facing. These are the kinds of organizing, the kinds of discussions that, first of all, have a ton of impact on people's lives, and they often also are about topics that have nothing to do with where we as a country should be in terms of our identity on X, Y, or Z issue. They're about the brass tacks, facts that really determine people's lives. And this includes things like, will your state or your county provide resources to help families who are dealing with addiction? Will there be resources available for people when they are in poverty and need a little bit of extra help? I think that kind of communal organizing and political back and forth is a lot more palatable. It's a lot more bite-sized. It allows us to actually know our neighbor, know the people that we're engaging with and debating with, and in that way, I think, understand a little bit more of how people are coming, where people are coming from, and how we can move forward to a solution.
Thank you. This question comes from Constance, and she writes that she's hoping that your soul has optimistic paths to civil, serious, honest conversation that you see out there. What do those look like? And how can we build, she asks, bridges and not walls?
Yeah. My soul. What a troubled place to start this question these days. I will bring up what I brought up in the lecture again, which is really, truly, I hear often from people a sense of lament. And it's not just people who feel like they're losing on the losing side of politics, there are a lot of people who have a very broad cross-section of views who look at our country and the tenor of the political debate and the coarseness of the political debate and the sense of dehumanization that I think is a character of our politics today. And they say, I don't want this. I don't want to live in this country. I don't want this to be the way that we are. And fundamentally, I don't want this to be what defines us and defines our communities. And so I take some hope from that in the sense that I'm allowed to take hope as a reporter. I do think that out of that sense of lament, a desire that people profess to have a different kind of politics, there can be paths that we take towards turning down that temperature of national politics, and again, having communities that are the locus of how we discuss who we are, rather than having these really abstract debates. In terms of how to make that happen, I'm afraid I'd have to be in a different profession to give you the prescriptions there, but all I can say is that I think after the election subsides, I hope people turn off the TV, turn off the cable news, be in community to the extent that they can, look for ways forward after COVID-19 to be in community, and find those spaces of really being with one another as people, rather than investing in that big national conversation.
They should keep reading The Atlantic, though.
That's right. Sorry. The other thing I should say, subscribe to The Atlantic.
You know, I was thinking as you were talking about something you said earlier in regard to the sort of responsibility that our political leaders have. You know, there's a debate that's going to happen very shortly. You know, what might they do to help what you just talked about? I mean, how can it be done better than the last debate?
That also might be above my pay grade, and I don't know if there's really any way, because I think the dynamic is just so toxic. But here's what I'll say, which is maybe a way of skirting around your question. I think that a lot has been invested in the presidential election and the presidential debate, and there's a good reason for that. The President of the United States is an important office. It really matters, and I think it especially matters for setting the tone of who we are as a country. And yet, there are competitive Senate races all across the country that are going to be hugely politically important, maybe even more so than an attempt to flip the White House by the Democrats. There are competitive House races, and the ability of Democrats to hold the margin in the House of Representatives will be politically important. And most of all, there are tons of state House races and local school board races and all sorts of elections that are going on. And so I'm not trying to discount the importance of the debate or the presidential election, but I think the more expansive our view of politics can be, the less weight we put on this singular figure who's occupying the White House, I think the better off we'll all be.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma, for your insights, your challenges, your hopeful vision of what we might be. You have blessed us. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. To learn more about this vibrant church, our ministry, our outreach to those in need, our lively conversations about things that matter, go to fapc.org, sign up for our emails, dip your toe in the water, see what you think. You never know, your soul might find itself a home. God bless and good night.